Hello everyone, today we talk about John II Komnenos, one of the most important sovereigns in Byzantine history. Some scholars saying, it was also the best of the Komnenians. This is debatable in the sense that objectively, Alexius, John himself, and Emmanuel, that incidentally we made a video about recently, were all, great sovereigns. I would say Alexius was in a founding sense, right? Especially also considering the previous trend of imperial history, probably the best of the Komnenians. But it's a matter of how also you can play on the uncertainty of certain aspects of their lives, properly from a strictly historical point of view. We often don't know all what we would like to know, especially from a quantitative standpoint, right? I personally think, for example, that Emmanuel Komnenos is dramatically overlooked. John is being indicated, as we were saying before, as probably possibly the best, but in practice, what is important is to really see what they did for what we know. And naturally, these videos are kind of manualistic introductions, so they're not up to that specific task, but in the future, as you know, we will deepen all this in more detailed and theme dedicated videos about specific aspects of each of these rulers. And the whole Byzantine history, telling the truth, because that's what we're basically doing here. So Alexius I, as you know, had managed with an indefatigable activity to relaunch the fate of the empire. Right, and when he died, he left to his son John a much more solid state than the one that he had when he had risen to the throne. And succession was not completely devoid of problems. John's owned Anna Komnena tried essentially a coup that failed. He maintained steady control. He also didn't participate to his father's funeral, fearing this coup. But there was not enough sympathy towards this attempt, and he fundamentally secured his imperial title in the following days. So he ruled between 1118 and 1143, and he, I can't say persecuted in general, actively the work of restoration of imperial power initiated by his father. It was a struggle for survival in insight, but the energy with which the Komnenians brought this further, the first three especially, is remarkable. In 1119, he began a campaign in Asia Minor, in Anatolia, against the Seljuks. And this was the first concern for the empire ever since the defeat of Manzikert 50 years before, that, as you know, had fundamentally stripped the Romans from the Anatolian hinterland, so causing a loss of somewhat the most important estates, of which the bulk of the military was based. It was not an irreparable coup, and especially the Komnenian emperors demonstrated this, meaning that the empire had surely the strength to recover from that and to reverse the situation, right? So the myth that Manzikert was the beginning of the end is just doesn't stand historiographically anymore. It was important to recover the Anatolian hinterland also because the most productive areas of the peninsula were fundamentally the ones along the coasts, traditionally, the urbanized areas with important maritime traffics and so on. And that, lacking fundamentally a continental connection between the two would mostly invest into overseas policy, and therefore kind of driving away in a kind of centrifugal direction from the empire itself. John Komnenos, for example, brought under again fundamentally the quasi-independent rule of some magnates like the ones of Trebizond, for example, and he recovered large parts of probably western Anatolia, and that's what he stood. There's his first campaign in 1119 that he was, as we will see, he would abort it, important success, because he was called elsewhere, but eventually also in later life he continued with his work of reconquest, especially of important strongholds on the hinterland, securing important areas such as, the ones also that were important for connecting Constantinople with Antioch, that, as we will see, will also fall into this work of a reconquest, and actually of impressive power imposed on the Crusader states, that at some point revealed here under John that they were fundamentally open to, they were weak in front of the restored imperial power. They wouldn't have properly armies to oppose the John's ones. And in fact, John is famous also for this relentless siege capacity, right? He basically tended to something like 25. He properly commanded 25 sieges, right, in storming stronghold after stronghold and securing step by step this internal routes. This is on the frontiers. This was done also partly on the Balkans, with the reestablishment of the Circassian, for example, and and with the general policy of the empire that had to obviously, like also other powers at the time, telling the truth, creating a sort of space of frontier that fundamentally would provide for a war zone in case of hostilities, but would maintain the core lands of the empire relatively safe from incursions, right? So re-extending it both in Anatolia and the Balkans was the main objective here. It was continued also under Emmanuel and so on. And scholars have said, look at what John did, investing mostly, not completely, as we will see, in siege, the conquest of strongholds, and not in major campaigns of invasion and massive pitched battles like it would be on, Emmanuel's case. But that's actually debatable, even if you see the same, open field engagements between the two. There's not a dramatic difference. It's just, when things go well, right, we tend also to overlook dramatically battles like Byzantine military history, like John victories at Beroia or Haram, but let's assume they had lost there. Maybe we would be talking about the great failure of John Komnenos that was too eager to give battle, right, and lost it, like, Emmanuel at Miro Caliphate, right? No, that's just a subjective perspective, let's say. But we gotta give, in fact, that John's military activity was largely successful. And even there, we don't know all we would like to know about certain outcomes, especially in terms of strategical balance. But sometimes it was also, exhausting the enemies, taming them, but exhausting yourself at the same time. So the cost-benefit ratio was always very, delicate. But it seems that under John's reign, there wasn't a particular strain, at least an excessive one, of imperial resources, right? That's important to stress. He was also he was called Kaloyannis, right? Not because he was good looking, on the contrary, seemingly he was particularly ugly. Also, he was so dark skinned that he was called the Moor. But he was, called good for his character. He seemingly didn't put to death anybody, at least, openly or politely, or displaying a particular cruelty, which is a big deal for the time. He also remained. He led also ecclesiastical policy going by itself. Different, these are also perceptions in a sense. But you say compared also to Emmanuel's reign, where everybody says, these huge campaigns of expansion, but at which cost? Well, it doesn't seem that the economical status of the empire was that bad, right? And surely, however, he had capitalized on his father's accomplishment, just like John did with his own, with Alexis. So this campaign in Asia Minor against the Seljuks was aborted, as we were saying before, in spite of having obtained a remarkable success, because of a new Balkan threat brought by the Pechenegs, also kind of have been auxiliary of the Rus. The Pechenegs in 1122 crossed the Danube. They arrived up to Macedon and Thrace. So at this point, John attacked them, faced them in battle, defeating them in such a heavy way to free forever the empire from the threat of the property of these people. And the battle is the Battle of Beroia in 1122. He basically attacked their camp, right, almost by surprise, and the battle was very harsh. The emperor himself was wounded by an arrow in his leg, but seemingly the situation was resolved by the Varangian Guard, comprised mostly of Englishmen at that point. It attacked the Pecheneg Wagenburg, right, with their double hand axes and breaking into it and making a massacre fundamentally. This also, we will see it in other videos, is we made just the first phase of the Varangian Guard development. This is kind of the middle phase, or maybe not. We discussed about this, I don't remember too, but aside from it, in the periodization you want to give, the Byzantine military at this point had been dramatically revived, right, in terms of military power. And in these, in the Komnenian age is somewhat the testament of that, but also properly of the recovery capabilities of the empire. So also in a situation it would have been allegedly hopeless or rigged or whatever. No, it was a great moment of expansion and of still defensive capacities. Then John, by having defeated the Pechenegs, was obliged to carry on the Balkan operations with two subsequent campaigns against Serbia and Hungary that kept him busy for some years. These were, as we will see, crowned with success, but also their consequences were less, definitive, of course, for the empire, and especially against the Hungarians. It seems that it was just a ceasefire because things were becoming too costly, and naturally Hungary and Constantinople couldn't wipe each other out, and there was always this frontier area. And Serbia is an important tassel here, and we will make an excursus about the two countries in this sense in relation to Constantinople, what had been up to those years. So Serbian power begins to affirm itself at this point, right? The Serbs were like the Croats, a population originally of the lands north of the Carpathians that had been settled by Heraclius back in the day, in the 7th century, in the Balkans to essentially stem the Avar expansion. This is important because the Serbs, as you know, would always kind of try to counter they would fall mostly in the Hungarian orbit, and they would always, as a frontier, mountainous, kind of warlike society, to push this power out in a way or another, even though being the weaker one. So it's always a complicated thing to do. The Balkan hinterland, as we know, is a freaking mess from a strategic point of view. There are certain areas you probably can't, even in Ottoman times, like think about Montenegro, they couldn't be controlled. Like, there would be some garrisons there, but in the valleys people would fundamentally leave as. Of course, these were more peripheral areas, so they're the ones that counted the least, but yet. And guerrilla would go on. It was never like a stable control on the long run, on the whole thing. And the Croatian and Serbian original ethnicity is actually unknown. Some people think, that it might have been actually, Iranian, of the Iranian stock, probably Slavs. So, but in any case, wherever their background was, they ended up to assimilate with the local Slavic population fundamentally. And differently from the Croats that fundamentally would fall under the Western influence, right, through the subjection to the Frankish Empire and the subordination to the Roman Church, as the Croatians are Catholic still today. The Serbians maintain instead, and for a long time, very close cultural and political relations with Constantinople, and becoming fundamentally Orthodox. But things initially weren't that easy, because this area was somewhat floating, also territorially, and falling under the influence of different powers. The Serbs lived in communities known as Županje or Šupe, under a prince known as Župan, and the Roman Empire seems to have maintained at least a nominal sovereignty on them up to the first half of the 19th century. Right, these were not particularly, but there were clans fundamentally that would very gradually form some kind of more central capacity, and they would fall normally under mostly the Roman orbit, because as we were saying before, the Hungarians were the Magyars that arrived, etc. Whoever controlled the Pannonian Plain, what was the most was the closest power and the one that bothered them the most. So with Constantinople was the better option for them, for a more decentralized position. However, but the mid-10th century, the Serbs, we can't say with a lot of approximations, this is just like Venice and the Crucible, whatever the specific year, but we could say they became independent from it, right? They became properly an actor on its own, internationally speaking, by approximation. However, the relations between the Serbs and Constantinople became, again, close at the time of Basil I, right? With this moment of, as we have seen, of a great reaffirmation of imperial power, also in the Balkans, with the defeat also of the Bulgarians, these were also other harassers, let's say, of the Serbs, with the acceptation properly of Orthodox Christianity and a sort of political vassalage to the empire, maintained by the Serbs fundamentally up to the first half of the 11th century. Because at that point, the most important Serbian principality, known as Duklja or Zeta, managed to ensure again sort of independence. It was confirmed eventually in 1077 with dissent from the side of Pope Gregory VII. It was reactivating, as you know, a great universal policy and properly creating what would become the papal monarchy as such, and also in a competitive policy against Constantinople, of course, the Orthodox Church, a royal crown to the Župan Michael, that thus, as it had happened also for the Bulgarians actually at some point, had formally fallen into the Roman, the Roman Christian political orbit, right? And this was still a time which Central Europe, the Balkans, were still very fluid from a political point of view, and the Catholic Church of Rome had a great projection capacity and influence capacity, because naturally these powers, while, as you understand here, becoming more powerful and emancipating themselves from the closest, controller, like Constantinople, they could claim further autonomy and dependency on another power, like the one of Rome, that was fundamentally connected with the empire, and even the Hungarians were Catholic at this point, but still didn't have that reaching properly capability. As we've seen, the Serbians were stuck in the mountains, etc. There wasn't a threat from the west in that sense. And on the contrary, actually, at this time, as we will see, and especially with Russia, it was an important also opening to the Adriatic Sea, an important connection. It's probably overlooked, but let's say that at the beginning of the 12th century, with the decadence of the Zeta, the preeminent role on the Serbian people was assumed by the governors of Russia. That was a principality taking its name from the fortress of Rash. That was the residence of the prince. And the independence of the Serbian people was, however, not particularly long. And at the end of the 11th century, the country altogether, independently from the internal balance, came back under the imperial supremacy, in fact with the Komnenian restoration, let's say, and that was maintained, even though with frequent rebellions, up to the second half of the 12th century. We've seen it. We've seen the struggles against the Serbians, also in the video about Emmanuel Komnenos. It was very harsh subjugation, because they, fundamentally, the Byzantines didn't think much of these people in general, and they had, there was an asymmetry for which naturally they could deliver a hell of of force over them, but still never basically to be able, as we've seen before, to territorially control the land on the long run. Right? These were warlike mountaineers. They fled in the mountains, in the forests. They lived like that. And it was also a relatively peripheral land, also for the economical interest altogether. Hungary was much of a problem, but still securing them, because they would act also dependingly on the interest, either pro the Romans or pro the Hungarians, etc. So that's why Constantinople needed to secure also that there. Also because the area around what was Sirmium, Belgrade, etc. was of key strategic importance. So if in the area they had these turbulent populations, well, it was surely a source of weakness. Speaking instead of the Angers, the Magyars, and later Hungarians on the long run, well, these people had probably long relations with Constantinople already since the 6th century, when they lived between the Don River and the Caucasus Mountains. But they would enter decisively in the political scene of the empire in the 9th century, when they migrated west, reaching in part the plains north of the Danubian estuary, the mouth of the Danube. And at the end of the century, pressed by the Pechenegs, they migrated into the Pannonian plain, destroying the Moravian kingdom in 906. And from here, as it had been for the Avars, etc., they launched, as we know, periodical incursions both in the west but also in the Balkan territories subjected to Constantinople, pushing in fact twice up to the walls of the same capital. Yes, the Magyars hit mostly the west, right, hard, also pretty far up to Italy, Spain, etc. Mostly it's in Germany actually, but the Balkan dimension is not to be overlooked, and threatening even the same Constantinople. So, in spite devastating, however, such incursions were just temporary in character, because they mostly didn't affect the fortified cities against which the originally nomadic military organization of their people, based on rapid cavalry incursions, was virtually powerless. But always remember, in this sense, that most conquests of cities or fortresses in the Middle Ages did not happen by siege, but for obviously for political reasons. That is, if the enemy was too powerful, there was no way of being relieved, etc. Certain places would fall, because there is always a side within every single place that opens the gates when it sees that thing is more convenient. So the game is always on that base. But as we know, the heavy defeat suffered at Lechfeld by Otto I in 955 put an end to the nomadism of the Magyars, and later on, Hungary would constitute itself as a stable nation, mostly under the work of the Prince Jedza, right, and especially of the successor Stephen I, 1038. That was probably the first king of Hungary. So the Christianization of the Hungarians had happened roughly towards the 70s of the 10th century, brought the people within the orbit of the Roman Church, of the Pope, we mean, as much as the Hungarians had fundamentally been drawn mostly into the Western field. But still, the Byzantine influence remained, and in the area it overlapped, and this also was very convenient for the Hungarians. It could play, according to also to the balance of the powers of the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Imperial one. In fact, the Hungarian political relations, let's say, and cultural relations too, which is shown even militarily speaking, still by the 12th century, I would say Hungarians look much more Byzantine than say, Frankish in military style, at least in outfit. Maybe the substance of the army was surely, however, transforming more in the Western sense, also because, lots of Western knights from all over Western Europe were being settled in Hungary. But let's say, there was this connection with Constantinople properly, and for more than 2 centuries, the main strategic consequence was having a common frontier along the Middle Danube and the Sava rivers. So the connection with Constantinople became very intense, especially in the 11th century, as it is witnessed also by the presence at the Hungarian court of crowns that were sent as a gift from the Byzantines, with a political and symbolical act that, according to the times mentality, naturally stood to signify the hierarchical dependency of the Hungarian sovereign on the Roman Emperor. This is yet another thing that they could play with in terms of political balance. They are complex things, because it's not much a matter of, as we've seen, factual subjugation. By the 12th century, especially under II Komnenos, that will crush the Hungarian army at Serbian Hungary, kind of felt the most under the renewed Byzantine power. But let's say that it was mostly something that the Byzantines could afford in the process, in a very hard struggle of the Hungarian monarchy to rise, to autonomize it, to emancipate itself from the powers of the major magnates of the kingdom that still relied mostly on a more traditional nomadic idea of equality, from which the king was just one of them and not an overlord. But so it was very convenient to receive a crown from an ecumenic emperor, as a dynasty in Hungary at that point, to stress that, and not necessarily the fact that they were just under the empire. But it still was a way to also shift the balance of the play, as we've seen in the competition with the Holy Roman Empire and so on. And so one of the first of these crowns, that is the one sent by Constantine IX Monomachus, of which, by the way, in the 19th century some enamel plaques have been found, was probably given to the Hungarian king Andrew I, 1046-1060, while the second crown that constitutes, by the way, still today the inferior part of the Holy Crown of Hungary, was probably sent as a gift by Emperor Michael VII to Jedza I towards 1074, right? And the same king eventually married the niece of Nicephorus Botaniates, and later on in 1104 Piroska, daughter of King Ladislas I of Hungary, actually married John Komnenos, becoming thus Empress of Constantinople. And there are beautiful mosaics depicting John and Piroska. I inserted here even in the pictures. She looked really nice, I must say. And so coming back to more bio stuff, just for not to be too much sentimental about life in general. Right after the defeat of the Pechenegs, John Komnenos entered with his army in Serbia, as we were saying before, to obtain its complete subjugation. And he actually achieved a crushing victory over the Schupan of Russia, obliging the Serbs to recognize Byzantine suzerainty. These were, as we were saying before, the Byzantines would go full wild on the Serbs, like without scruples at all. Hostages and things that this would do with everybody, but here it was dramatically easier because they were somewhat more isolated and less people cared about them. So the strengthening of John's position in the Balkans, and also the claim to interfere in the Hungarian dynastic matters, as we've seen through his wife, ended up, however, to actually trigger a war with Hungary itself that started in 1128 with the Hungarian attack to the Imperial Balkans, and it was resolved in a brief time by a very successful counteroffensive of John that obliged the enemy to settle a peace. Right, the Hungarians specifically were defeated at Aram in the same year, but on the, let's say, imperial disengagement from the Danubian campaign, there are doubts about the strategical balance, right? It seems that things were not pacified at all around, not even with the Serbs completely, and even less with the Hungarians, because at this point the two were actually siding with each other against the renewed imperial powers in the region. So such peace, however, because the two contenders were exhausted on that front, and it was better to bail out objectively against guerrilla, in the area. But the possibility, this gave the possibility to John to resume the offensive in Anatolia against the Turks. And this brought actually to the subjugation of the emirate of Melita and of Cilicia, right? The Byzantines crushed specifically this Islamic power and the same Cilician Armenians in the south. This was very important strategically because if you have an idea of the area, it's extending further east, and especially the connection with the Taurus Mountains in Syria, etc. And as we will see now, the Byzantines were always eager to reconquer the big one. It was Antioch, right, and possibly, of course, also Jerusalem. And in fact, the first one, Antioch, actually capitulated in the summer of 1137. This was in the hands of the Crusaders. The Prince of Antioch was Raymond of Poitiers, that was obliged actually to swear an oath of allegiance to John. It was a moment of great reaffirmation of imperial power. There was in the area. John actually campaigned from there. He received the obedience also from Edessa, from the other powers, but he also threatened properly to make, quote, an armed pilgrimage, so copying the same Westerners in phraseology, to Jerusalem, and King Falk of Jerusalem freaked out at that point, began to beg John to arrive, but without the army that he had, the massive army he had used to reassert his power there. He campaigned in Syria, then he had to come back to Anatolia, and he didn't accomplish fully the subjugation of Syria. He received mostly this formal obedience, but just the display of Byzantine power in the area was remarkable at that point. He would fundamentally recover Pamphylia. He reconnected fundamentally northwestern Anatolia with Antalya, and so securing this corridor also that was incidentally also the same Crusader land route in Anatolia between Constantinople and Syria. Either by sea or by land. And he would have probably gone to Palestine at that point. But on April the 8th, 1143, John died after a hunting accident. He actually was killed by a poisoned arrow, and there were voices about the fact that the Latin mercenaries in his army were, killed him because of how he had treated the Crusaders of Antioch and so on, but there is really no proof about that. And a parenthesis deserves actually the Venetian policy, because this had been a bit the cornerstone of Alexius I's policy, and things changed with John. This basically, they entered in a crisis that would create a conflict with what had been traditionally an allied power, right? In fact, throughout all the reign of Alexius I, Venice had been in clear advantage, both over the Byzantine merchants and the other Italian maritime republics, and its condition of strength was not shaken even by the Treaty of 1111 with Pisa, to which Alexius I had granted also important but still inferior commercial privileges compared to the ones of provided given to the Venetians. And at the moment, the Genoese were also excluded from such benefits. Genoa fundamentally, there would be a time before 1204 in which still the Byzantines tried to counterbalance Venetian power. The Genoese one, it was mostly a Paleologo thing, and later Byzantine period. I mean, the reliance on Genoa against the fundamentally enemy Venetians at that point. However, things changed brusquely, basically just after the rise to power of John. A Venetian embassy reached Constantinople in 1119 to obtain the renewal of the previous treaty, the one stipulated by Alexius, but John refused. Right, and we don't really know why John II had adopted this decision. It's been thought that at that point Constantinople didn't need so much naval power as it had been the case before. Here, actually, John worked pretty hard for a diplomatic connection with the Holy Roman Empire. Right, he I think it was a niece of Conrad II who got married eventually with Emmanuel. It was not just a first class in marriage, internationally speaking, but also Emmanuel was not here, right? Yet. If I'm not wrong, it was Isaac, it was called, the first son. I don't remember. I mean, and then he died in Cilicia, if I'm not wrong. But Emmanuel was not yet the first heir. But the objective was to essentially create this Byzantine-German axis against the Siculo-Normans, that, as you know, were the main threat of the Byzantine Balkans. At that point, the Normans had raided hard from Sicily, places like Thessalonica, like had hit an ardent Greece. So there were other options at this time than just, granting this very important privileges to the Venetians, who were arrogant, right? They surely wanted more and more, and especially it might have not been maybe just a matter of, strength ratios between the empire and Venice, that, as we will see, would in fact reveal itself in favor of Venice at sea. But it might have been properly that the subjects of the empire were being somewhat discontent about Venetian presence, etc. So it's an internal political matter of, of bounds that we don't clearly understand from the sources for John's reign, at least. And so the lacked renewal of the treaty was actually ruinous for Venice. But initially there was no reaction. It's only in 1122 that the Republic started to make naval reprisals in Byzantine territory. So the Imperial fleet at this point was not capable to cope with the Venetian attacks that went on for 4 years. Right, the Venetians acted basically unmatched, obtaining a series of success that, were enough to bring the emperor to capitulation, right? So that's just maybe the only, what the hell? Well, why did it happen? We just don't know. So John eventually let the Venetian Doge know that he was ready to ratify the treaty, and in August 1126, the ambassadors of the Lagoon City concluded in Constantinople a new agreement that renewed and extended the privileges granted by Alexis I. And actually, it would be too much to tell more about the Emperor John II, and as I was saying at the beginning, we will do it at some point. But for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.